They erased me from payroll overnight, forgot my key card, still opened the server room. The system they hijacked still whispered in my language. The building didn't hum the same after 7:30 p.m. Fluorescent lights clicked overhead like they weren't quite sure whether to stay on. The air conditioning ran quieter, softer, almost respectful, like the building itself knew someone was inside who wasn't supposed to be. Miles slid his ID badge across the reader like he had 1,000 times before. No beep, no rejection, just a soft green light and the click of the lock surrendering. They forgot to deactivate his keycard. Or maybe they hadn't gotten to it yet. Either way, it was their first oversight. He walked past the empty cubicles slowly, without hiding. He didn't need to. Everyone who mattered had gone home, confident the problem was solved, confident that payroll was now in safer hands. But Miles didn't come to reclaim anything. He came to watch, and more importantly, record. The server room smelled like cold plastic and ambition. This wasn't the mainframe. This was the backup system. The redundant layer no one paid attention to unless something failed. And that's exactly where he wanted to be. His fingers moved across the keyboard like they were made for this. No wasted clicks, no unnecessary searches. Just 2 directories deep, 1 folder unhidden, and suddenly, there it was. A shadow line in the payroll output. One that didn't. The file manual was innocuous. FY25_Agilist final_V2BEC, except no backup file should be writing new entries past the cutoff date. And yet, 3 new names had been processed yesterday, all marked internal contractors, all tied to project codes that had been frozen since the budget rollback last month. Miles didn't flinch. He just reached behind the backup monitor, unplugged the black USB drive he'd planted weeks ago, and slid in a new one. Each click was silent, each capture logged with timestamps. This wasn't about proving anything yet, it was about watching them prove it for him. 1 line of code, pulled from the export script, made his breath stop. It was an if-then exception that bypassed normal approval routing, if the payee ID contained a specific 3-letter sequence, JDR. It wasn't a coincidence. That sequence was the internal alias of Jeremy D. Rothwell, the same junior finance lead who'd been promoted mysteriously 3 months ago and who just happened to share a gym membership with Preston, the same CEO who'd smiled while firing Miles over Zoom. Too expensive, Preston had said. We're moving toward a leaner model. Lean, apparently, meant invisible payments to invisible people. Miles closed the log file, renamed the extraction folder to temp_docs, and disconnected the USB without a sound. He didn't speak, didn't shake his head, didn't even smile. The camera behind the ceiling tile caught him from above, just as planned. Because Miles had installed that camera 2 years ago, back when no one paid attention to security for the backup floor. It had no audio, no remote feed, just silent, frame-by-frame timestamps that recorded only when motion was detected. And today it saw him not tampering, not deleting, just watching, documenting, the very thing they forgot he was best at. On his way out, he paused by the old print server, one no one used anymore but was still mapped across the network. He didn't print anything, he just checked the queue. Empty, which meant no one had caught on, yet. He pulled the access log from his badge, showing that his ID was still classified under internal security access. That meant they hadn't reassigned his digital tier yet. Another oversight. Or maybe they thought he'd be too broken to log in again. That was the thing about people like Preston. They didn't fire people. They erased them. Quietly, thoroughly, surgically. But Miles had worked long enough to know, systems don't forget what people try to erase, they just hide it better. That night, as he stepped into the elevator and felt the doors close behind him, he whispered the only thing he'd said aloud all day. "See ghosts in the ledger. Let's see who believes in them." His voice didn't echo. The building was listening. It started as a routine bounce back, nothing dramatic, just a red warning dot on Jeremy's screen that said delivery failed, unknown recipient. He frowned at the message, clicked it open, and reread the email he thought he had forwarded to Preston the night before. Subject line, "Ghost load approved. Run W/quiet flag." Miles wasn't supposed to see that. No one was, really. It was an internal nickname between Jeremy and his inner circle, a lazy label they used when triggering off-book contractor payments through the dummy shell accounts embedded in the auxiliary payroll layers. But this time, instead of going to Preston's private inbox, the autofill feature had done something else. It had added M. Conway from the historical contact list. an account that technically should have been deactivated, but because of a sync delay in the internal directory, was still routing to a mirrored archive Miles had configured months ago for audit compliance. Jeremy didn't notice, not at first. He just assumed it was some sort of lag. Maybe IT was doing maintenance again. But Miles noticed. He noticed at 2:37 a.m.e. when the auto-forward pinged his encrypted inbox with the entire thread, complete with timestamp, metadata trail, and the attached approval form containing fake contractor codes and falsified initials. He didn't reply. He didn't call anyone. He had just saved it. Then printed a hard copy, single sheet, unmarked, folded it once, and placed it under a stack of invoices on the backup desk he still technically had access to. Not to hide it, but to wait. Because some documents don't need to be sent. They just need to be discovered at the right moment, by the right person. The next morning, Jeremy's voice echoed down the hallway louder than usual. Fake confidence had a sound, and today it was booming. "Look," he said to the project manager, "if we don't hit target by end of quarter, this whole thing gets reviewed. So let's just clean the slate and push these bonuses early. I'll handle approvals." The PM nodded, but didn't look convinced. She didn't like rushing payroll lines. Especially not after the last memo from finance flagged discrepancies in the contractor layer. Jeremy, of course, smiled through it, because people like him relied on noise, meetings, jargon, energy, anything to drown out questions. But the question was already in the room, in the form of a silent printout tucked under a budget report. When Jenny from compliance picked up the pile for routine ledger reconciliation, she almost skipped it. One sheet didn't belong. It wasn't even labeled. But something about the formatting caught her eye. No letterhead, no signature block, just clean rows of allocation codes, flagged with ear ride, ghost _ flag _ true. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it didn't belong. She didn't call anyone. She didn't escalate. She just walked it quietly to Miles's old desk, still half intact because no one had reassigned it yet, and left it there. A silent offering to a presence they all suspected hadn't really left. Miles watched it all from the CCTV footage he still had remote access to. The feed from the mailroom, the hallway outside finance, the one above the communal printer, they all synced back to the same dashboard he'd quietly built over the years, not to spy, just to observe patterns. Now the pattern was clear. Jeremy had gotten careless, and the system had started noticing. Miles opened a new document that evening. Title: P Recon Memo _1. No accusations, just observations, just questions phrased in perfect neutrality. Was an exception protocol approved on file 18B19C? Was ghost _ flag reserved for system-level backups or active distributions? Does finance hold the original contractor forms for JDR 881 through JDR 883? He didn't sign it, just dropped it anonymously into the interdepartmental review queue using an internal tool he helped design. The same tool they still used to review whistleblower alerts. And the best part, that tool anonymized sender data using a logic tree, one that still ran his code, so when Jeremy tried to trace it, he'd get nothing. Just a dead-end IP and a ping that landed somewhere between Zurich and Des Moines. The next 72 hours unfolded like slow motion. The project manager flagged the ghost entries, compliance filed a silent alert, HR opened an access audit. None of it traced back to Miles, not directly, but the pressure built, quietly, enough that Jeremy started slipping. First, a defensive Slack message, sent to no one in particular but vague enough to feel like a warning. People need to stop digging into approved overrides. This isn't helping the budget crisis. Then a huddle with Preston behind closed doors that stretched for over an hour, followed by an urgent call to legal. All of it. Recorded, not illegally, just archived. Because every move they made was within a system Miles still understood better than they ever would. They had erased his name from payroll, but not from the system, not from the tools. And now, every accidental step they took left footprints on architecture he'd laid down piece by piece. That's the thing about legacy systems. They don't forget their architect, and sometimes they report back, quietly, faithfully, even after you've been replaced. There are two kinds of meetings in a company. The ones that show up on calendars and the ones that matter. The latter rarely involve invites. No Zoom links, no subject lines. just closed doors and lowered voices. On Thursday afternoon at 4:11 p.m., Preston scheduled one, not through the company server, knew better, but through his personal assistant's Outlook, masked as a vendor alignment session. The room was Conference 4B, windows shaded, glass doors magnetically sealed. In attendance, Preston, Jeremy, CFO Marla Vane, and one unfamiliar man in a gray blazer with a leather-bound notebook and no visible ID badge. Preston's voice opened the meeting, firm but strained. "We've got noise in the system. If it's internal, I want it traced." Quietly. Jeremy didn't speak right away. He was tapping his pen too fast. Marla glanced at the notebook in front of her. "Ghost flags shouldn't be visible to mid-level audit," she said. "That's a compliance failure." The man in gray leaned forward. "Or an intentional breadcrumb." No one answered. No one had to, because in that silence, a truth was being swallowed. Someone still inside the structure, someone forgotten, was watching them. But what none of them realized was that the room they were in, the one they thought was safe, wasn't just a room. It was a test site. 3 years ago, when Miles had overhauled the security infrastructure, he'd tagged 3 rooms across HQ for acoustic pattern testing, rooms built to measure vocal clarity against reflective sound panels. He'd used room 4B twice, then never touched it again, but he left the baseline equipment installed, not recording, just passively buffering waveforms to the internal sound analysis server set to purge every 30 days, unless someone with admin-level access told it otherwise. And Miles had told it otherwise, months ago, quietly. A single line of code preserved a rolling archive, just in case someone tried to manipulate risk reports in rooms that weren't visible. That buffer file now held 49 minutes of unfiltered conversation, and Miles didn't need a transcript. He just needed one name, one mistake. It came at minute 17, when Jeremy said it out loud. "I ran the JDRs through his old channel. It was cleaner. He never disabled it." Marla flinched. Preston didn't. "Then scrub it now. I don't want that pipeline existing by Monday." The man in gray finally looked up. "If it exists at all, we'll find it." But they wouldn't. Not fast enough. Because while they sat in that room talking about silencing footprints, Miles had already set a read-only mirror of the ghost ledger to publish into a hidden sandbox directory, one triggered only if the original files were touched in a purge attempt. Preston's scrub order would be the matchstick, and Miles had already poured the gasoline. Outside the glass, an intern walked past, young, probably no older than 23, earbuds in, carrying a tray of drinks. She didn't glance into the room. She didn't need to. Miles had trained her 3 summers ago. Her name was Lana. She had a minor in information systems and a habit of remembering tiny things, like the fact that Conference 4B used to have an extra audio jack that wasn't listed on any schematics, and that Miles once told her, offhandedly, "Don't trust any meeting that requires blinds." That night, the recording from room 4B, saved as echo_buffer_17B WAB. Miles didn't even listen to it. He didn't need to. He encoded it, zipped it, and placed it in the sandbox, alongside the ghost flag payload, all under the label auto-deploy on deletion request. He didn't plan to release it, not yet, maybe never. That wasn't the point. The point was that he didn't have to fight them to beat them. He just had to let them trip over the wires they forgot they laid themselves. As he shut his laptop for the night, the building lights dimmed on the security cam grid. Room 4B went dark, but for the first time in weeks, Miles whispered a sentence, not for the system, not for the files, but for himself. He should have held the meeting in person, offsite, not in my echo chamber. The first deletion request came at 2:04 a.m., routed through a batch job labeled archival_cleanup_Q3B, initiated from Jeremy's credentials, but tunneled through the CFO's authorization tier. It was disguised as routine, a cleanup of dormant accounts older than 90 days. Except one line in the command string didn't belong. Path equals /int_mirror/temp_docs/ghost_flag/ghost_flag/ghost_flag. The moment it pinged, the sandbox activated. Not with sound, not with flashing lights, just a silent fork, code splitting into 2 paths. One executed as they intended, wiping the mirrored files from the visible directory. The other, written by Miles over 18 months ago, performed a different task entirely. It triggered a delivery package labeled Echo Set 19, compressing key data and queuing it for offsite archival. To the naked eye, nothing changed. No alerts were sent, no logs flagged, but within 8 minutes, 3 compressed payloads were dispatched to 3 separate endpoints, each one listed in a nondescript file titled board_ethics_legacy-cm. One server belonged to an external audit firm that had worked with the company during a past antitrust compliance review. The second was tied to a legal firm Preston once used to negotiate vendor disputes. And the third, a cloud drive silently shared with Lana 3, a private archival inbox Miles had created when she was still just an intern. No one noticed. Not that night. Not the next morning either. Preston arrived at 9:07 a.m.e., confident. Jeremy followed, trying not to look like he'd been up all night. By 10:12, the Compliance Review Board had been summoned for an urgent pre-quarter review. Marla smiled like everything was fine, but systems don't smile back. They just reflect. At 10:38, a notification blinked on Lana's laptop while she was at her desk reviewing changelogs. One new file, size 18187 MB, title, Echo Set 19. She didn't open it immediately, just read the footer of the metadata where Miles had embedded a message. Only if they lie first. She closed the laptop and waited. At 11:22, Preston stood in front of the team, hands folded, blazer perfect, voice calm. We've identified some inconsistencies in auxiliary payroll and have already initiated internal cleanups. No fraud was committed, just redundant scripts that weren't fully deprecated. Jeremy nodded behind him. Marla added, "We appreciate everyone's vigilance." The room nodded, muted approval. Even Lana didn't speak. But that was the moment. The lie. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even entirely direct. But it was deliberate. Intentional misdirection. And that's all EchoSet needed. Lana stood, walked to the shared terminal by the server room, and opened the sandbox access portal. She didn't log in as herself. She used the audit-level credential chain Miles had granted her before he left, one he called for when truth. She pressed one key, just one, and the Echo Set went live. The firm's legacy partners received the data first, not dramatic, not viral, just a quiet upload notification flagged potential ethics breach, priority, gray. By noon, an internal ping bounced across the compliance board's backend, not loud, not disruptive, just a ripple, but enough. By 2:00 p.m., the audit team was on site. Preston was still smiling, Jeremy wasn't, and Marla had stopped making eye contact. They didn't know what was in the files, not exactly. They only knew someone had tripped something, that somewhere beneath the floorboards of their control, a system was speaking in a voice they couldn't trace. And worse, couldn't silence. Meanwhile, Miles sat 3 blocks away, across from a cafe window, coffee cooling by his elbow, watching the headquarters building in the reflection of the glass. He didn't need to go back inside. His work was already in motion. The system didn't need him physically. It remembered him in architecture, in logic paths, in silent branches that triggered only under specific moral conditions. That was always the point, not to build a trap, but to build a mirror, one that only activated when someone chose to distort the image staring back. As the sun shifted behind the high-rise roofs, Miles finally took a breath, slow and deliberate, and murmured, "You tried to delete me. But I left roots. And the system? It heard him." At 7:41 p.m., Preston's private Slack pinged with a message he didn't expect. It wasn't from Jeremy, not Marla, not even legal. It was from Owen Tran, the same board liaison who'd barely spoken a full sentence to Preston since the last merger cycle. Just 3 words. "We need context." Preston stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Context for what? The only thing recent enough to raise flags was the Echo Conger, and that couldn't have been trade, could it? He clicked through to the internal dashboard. Ghost flags, still scrubbed, no anomalies showing, deletion logs clean. But then he noticed it. A new field had appeared in the compliance audit log, timestamped at 2:04 a.m., the same minute Jeremy ran the cleanup job. A simple phrase under metadata chain, Echo lineage, unresolved. That field wasn't part of the core dashboard. It wasn't even visible unless you had Tier 2 infrastructure access, and Preston didn't. But Miles used to, For 7 years, he wrote the back-end systems the company still ran on. He designed redundancies, layered protection, invisible flags that only activated under very specific logic trees. And one of those trees was tripped the night Preston thought he buried the problem. It wasn't just a breadcrumb. It was a signal flare, written in the quietest language possible. One only a ghost could have embedded. Preston turned in his chair, expression neutral but eyes narrow. Jeremy, what, exactly, did you run last night? Jeremy froze. Not visibly, but in that way people do when the oxygen leaves a room. Just a cleanup, per Marla's directive. Preston leaned forward. Did you include Sandbox directories? Only the mirrors. They were dormant. And the extraction channel. You scrubbed it? Jeremy stopped. He hadn't, because he didn't know it existed. Because no one did, except Miles. And now it was surfacing, slowly, like fog off a lake. Sir, Jeremy said, suddenly more formal, are you suggesting this is him? Preston didn't answer. Not directly. Just said, the system's speaking in a language none of us understand, so either it's haunted or someone's been feeding it. Marla entered then, holding a tablet. Her face wasn't concerned. It was unreadable. Legal just received an inquiry from Archer and Bourne, she said. They want to clarify legacy oversight roles on infrastructure tiers. Apparently there's a clause about transitional accountability tied to the previous director of systems. Silence. Jeremy blinked. Previous as in Miles Conway, Marla said. It's still coded in. He has conditional reactivation access during ethical review proceedings. They never revoked it. Preston swore under his breath. Quiet, controlled, then looked at the tablet Marla held. On it, a file, Echo Set 19. She tapped it open. The first line wasn't explosive, just surgical. 3 unauthorized payee entries were routed through a deprecated channel. Reactivated 46 days after the original director was removed from payroll. Matching contractor codes, JDR 881, JDR 882, JDR 883. Bypass flag confirmed. Preston's hands were still. Voice low. Is it public? Marla shook her head. Not yet, but it's moving. Quiet hands are reviewing it, and one of them asked if this might be sabotage. Jeremy scoffed. This is blackmail. It's retaliation. But even as he said it, the words tasted off. This wasn't messy, wasn't desperate. There were no demands, no leaks, no gloating, just patterns. Clean, cold, and deeply familiar. Because they all knew something no one wanted to say. This felt like Miles, the way it unfolded, the way nothing needed explanation, the way every piece didn't just reveal the next, it exposed the flaw in the thinking that allowed it. Jeremy sat back, trying to mask his panic with posture. So what's the move? Preston didn't answer immediately, just looked toward the office window, where the building lights cast a fractured reflection of the city beyond. He spoke, finally, not to Jeremy, not to Marla, just into the air. He's not trying to return. He's proving we never should have let him go. And with that, for the first time in weeks, Preston looked unsure, because this wasn't a system failure. It was a memory, one that still had root access. They always assumed the system was too big to belong to any one person. Layers of software, vendors, consultants, updates on top of updates. Preston believed that once Miles was removed, the system became theirs. That belief held until the diagram resurfaced. Marla found it buried under archived vendor contract folders, labeled infracore_ver 5_masterlogic VSDX. A Visio file no one had opened in 3 years. It wasn't even supposed to exist anymore. The vendor had delivered updated schematics last year, cleaned and modularized, but this one was different. Older, untouched. And on page 12, there it was. A red ink signature, half faded but still legible. Miles Conway. Title, Director of Systems Integrity and Tier Neo Gatekeeping. Below it, a clause written in fine print. Foundational frameworks governed by non-revocable access logic per compliance protocol, IF-17. Root layer triggers and sandboxed auto-escalation mechanisms are the responsibility of the architect until legally severed. Marla's voice wavered for the first time in weeks. They never legally severed him, Preston. That's not possible, Preston said quietly, jaw clenched. He was offboarded. HR processed it. HR removed his payroll, but not his protocol responsibility. It wasn't an oversight, it was structural. He designed it that way. Jeremy looked pale. So, he still has authority? Marla just nodded. If the system detects an ethical trigger, and if the architect is still bound by clause if 17, then sandbox protocols default back to him automatically. Without alerting internal admin, silence swelled in the room. Preston walked to the room, knuckles white against the sill. We built everything off that framework. That means every override, every purge, every redirect we've executed. He's seen, Marla finished for him. Jeremy stood up, pacing. But he hasn't released it publicly. Why? What's he waiting for? Marla didn't respond immediately. Then she said, almost too soft to hear. Maybe he wants us to look, to see what we've become, before the system tells the world. Preston turned around, face unreadable. Or maybe he's just given us rope. Meanwhile, across the city, Miles opened the original file, again. Not the one Marla had found, but the mirrored copy he stored off-site the day he finalized the architecture. He scrolled slowly, every section still pristine, every trigger point still untouched. It wasn't revenge, it was a record, and it had always been there. They just never looked past the updates, never read the foundation. He leaned back, watching the skyline dim through the warehouse window where he now worked quietly, advising a non-profit tech collective no one in his old world knew about. The irony didn't escape him. They tried to erase his name from the system, but forgot he was the system. And systems, when built right, don't die when people leave. They wait, and they respond only when prompted by the right sequence. That sequence had begun the moment Preston authorized the purge job. Miles didn't create the scandal. He just made sure the system would report it if someone tried to hide one. It wasn't a trap, it was a mirror. And now they were standing in front of it, seeing not Miles, but themselves. At 8:19 p.m., Marla sent a message to legal. Subject, clause if 17, urgent inquiry. She didn't copy Preston. She didn't copy Jeremy. She just attached the file and wrote, do we still owe root acknowledgement to the original architect? And if so, what rights does that restore? She hesitated, then added one more line, and what happens if he doesn't want them back? Because that was the part no one could admit. Miles might not want revenge. He might just want them to look at their reflection long enough to feel it. It was just a comment. Not active code, not executable, not something any compiler would flag. A faint gray line nestled deep inside the sync module _v 7.1 script, under a block that handled sandbox redundancies and log rotations. It had been there for years, harmless, unassuming, and technically irrelevant. But as Clara from external audit scrolled through the script late Thursday night, eyes tired but methodical, she paused, not because of the syntax, but because of the sentence. It read, if you're reading this, then someone tried to erase the record. You weren't meant to panic. You were meant to ask why. She blinked, read it again, then again. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't dramatic, but it didn't belong, and yet it did. The timestamp on the script dated back to Miles's tenure, before Preston, before Jeremy, before the system had grown bloated with hands that didn't understand what they were touching. Clara leaned back in her chair. This wasn't sabotage, it was structure, a philosophy embedded in logic. Miles didn't just build systems, he built questions, quietly embedded like mines that didn't explode, but waited patiently for thought. She highlighted the line, added a soft tag, note, contextual integrity marker, and attached it to her report. But internally, she already knew this wasn't a mistake. This was Miles speaking in his native language. Not through noise, but through nudges. Gentle, irrefutable nudges. At 10:02 a.m. the next morning, the internal review board opened their second closed-door session of the week. This time, Miles' name was mentioned openly, not as a suspect, not even as a saboteur, but as an architect who had quietly left behind a system that told the truth louder than any whistleblower ever could. Jeremy's voice cracked halfway through the meeting. This is getting out of hand. We've got dev teams scared to touch the code base. Compliance won't authorize further purges. Preston, say something. But Preston didn't. He just stared at the wall. because he'd seen it too. Lana had shown him, not directly, but through a chain of quiet escalation, internal screenshots that made their way up through people who weren't looking for drama, just clarity. And all of them saw the same thing: Miles's touch. Not in sabotage, but in intention, in restraint. He could have crippled the system. He could have leaked everything, but he didn't. All he did was let the system speak. Preston finally stood, calm, tired. We never understood what he built. We just inherited it. Jeremy threw his hands up. Then replace it, wipe it, rebuild from scratch if we have to. But Marla shook her head, voice low. We can't. Too many dependencies. If we pull it out without understanding it fully, the entire infrastructure folds. Jeremy looked around. So what then? We just let this ghost haunt the backbone of our operations? No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew. Miles wasn't haunting anything. He wasn't in the system. He was the system. And now that it was finally being read with the eyes of people who had something to lose, the message became clear. He never raised his voice, never demanded his job back. He just placed mirrors in the code, reflections no one noticed until the spotlight landed. And now that it had, the system wasn't rebelling. It was remembering. At 4:38 p.m., Clara submitted her final audit summary with one line under System Risk Outlook. No breach detected. System behaving as designed, possibly better than intended. In the quiet of his warehouse office, Miles read the forwarded report. He didn't smile. Just minimized the window and returned to his workshop bench, where a stack of older laptops waited to be refurbished and donated. He never intended to return, but the code did, in ways they never thought to measure. And now, they were face to face with a truth no patch could silence. It arrived at 6:14 a.m. No sender signature, no internal routing header. Just a plain text memo dropped silently into the shared executive inbox labeled Core Ops, Priority Only. Subject line: Asset Acknowledgement and System Integrity Clarification. Preston was the first to read it. He blinked twice, leaned forward, then read it again, this time slower. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't accusatory, it simply clarified. The first paragraph outlined the original system deployment logic from 5 years ago, citing documentation that had been archived under legal lock. The second laid out the specific conditions under which sandbox protocols could activate and under what circumstances the system was legally obligated to report data externally, regardless of internal rank. And the third? The third was what made the air shift. It read, in the absence of a formally executed revocation of architect-level stewardship, the system recognizes the originating signatory as a passive root authority. This recognition does not imply control, but does ensure accountability. If ethical triggers are activated, mirror protocols will escalate transparently. This clause is hard-coded and irrevocable. There is no name, no salutation, but at the bottom, in faint gray, was a single line. System verified this memo's integrity via logic thread 289B. If this was not authored internally, then the system wrote it itself, which should concern you more. Preston froze, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. Somewhere deep in the infrastructure they had inherited, the system had begun documenting itself, and worse, it was doing it in the voice of the man they'd tried to erase. Jeremy stormed into the room 15 minutes later, hair uncombed, holding a printed copy. Who wrote this? Legal denies it. IT has no record. Compliance is calling it unregistered communication. Preston didn't answer, just handed him the screen. Jeremy scanned it, mouth twitching. You think this is Miles? No, Preston said. This isn't Miles. This is the system finally speaking without him. Marla entered next, unusually quiet. Audit's escalating. Kara's team found multiple logic paths cross-referencing the same clause, if 17. It's replicating redundantly across backup servers. Jeremy threw the memo on the table. So what are we saying? That Miles coded an AI into our payroll infrastructure? Not AI, Marla said flatly, just structure. Recursive architecture, the kind that mimics thought when what it's really doing is holding memory. Preston's voice dropped. It's preserving his design philosophy. Jeremy turned, face flushed. This is absurd. No system becomes self-reflective. Marla didn't flinch, unless it was built that way. In another part of the city, Miles stood in an alley behind the community tech center, sipping cheap coffee from a chipped mug as the sunrise lit the rooftops. His phone vibrated once. A server ping. Not a breach, not an error, just a replication notice. Memo_core_ops, verified. He nodded once, then shut off the screen. He hadn't written the memo. Not directly, but he had written the pattern, a chain of logic threads designed to surface context when two conditions aligned. Unauthorized deletion attempt plus silent flag escalation. The system didn't fabricate. It didn't invent Kato. It simply recalled. And now, it had begun to echo. Not him, but his intent. Back at headquarters, the review board convened once more. This time, there was no bravado, no confident posturing, just silence. Lana sat in the back of the room, arms folded, watching. She'd seen the memo too, knew the phrasing, recognized the restraint, and she understood what no one in that room dared say out loud. This wasn't Miles knocking on the door, it was the Foundation itself, asking who they thought they were without him. And the worst part? No one had an answer. It was 11:46 p.m. when Preston finally placed the call. Not from his corner office, not from the encrypted line legal insisted he use. He stood alone, on the rooftop of his high-rise condo, the kind with glass rails and a view meant for people who always look down on others. Below him, the city pulsed, quiet, disinterested, unknowing. The wind bit at his sleeves, cold and indifferent. He hadn't saved the number, but his thumb hovered over the digits like muscle memory. Because some connections don't live in contact lists. They live in consequence. The phone rang once, twice. A pause. Then, Preston. Not a question, not a greeting, just a statement from a voice that hadn't been heard in over 7 months. It sounded neither surprised nor bitter. Just Preston. Like the call had already happened, and Preston was merely catching up to it. He swallowed. I didn't think you'd pick up. You did, Miles said, calm. Otherwise, you wouldn't have called. Silence spread like frost between them. Preston stepped back from the ledge, trying to steady his breath. It's escalating. There are memos now, system-generated, referencing clauses even legal didn't remember. And last night, the system flagged the board's request for suppression as a compliance anomaly. It's working then, Miles replied. Preston frowned. Working? The entire executive tier is on edge. IT won't touch the core tree. Compliance won't certify quarterly disclosures. Jeremy's talking about hard resets. Because they're afraid of a mirror, Miles said, not a breach. Preston exhaled, sharp. That's what this is, isn't it? A revenge loop. Quiet sabotage dressed as poetic integrity. Miles, if it were sabotage, your Q3 ledger would have been sent to the SEC 2 weeks ago. If it were revenge, your board would have heard my voice, not the system's. If I wanted to destroy you, I wouldn't be on the phone. I'd be silent. Preston sat down on the bench near the rooftop wall, head low. Then why did you build this? Because systems forget fast when people think they're the author, Miles said. I wasn't trying to stay. I was trying to leave something that wouldn't bend when you did. We didn't bend, Preston muttered. We trimmed dead weight. There it was, the reflex, the line he'd told himself every day since Miles walked out. But saying it now felt hollow, embarrassing. You trimmed the roots, Miles said quietly, and expected the walls to stay up. Preston didn't answer. He rubbed his temple, eyes closed. They want a name, Miles. Someone to blame for the memos, for the logic trees that replicate without command. You'll get no name, Miles said. Because I didn't program a ghost, I just taught the system how to tell the truth without waiting for permission. But it's pointing back to you. That's not the system's fault, Miles replied. That's yours. You built your empire on a structure I made, and then forgot to learn the language it speaks. Preston looked out over the city, teeth clenched. So, what happens now? That depends, Miles said. Do you want to fix the mirror, or just cover it again? They won't approve a rebuild, Preston said. Too much risk, too many dependencies. Then adapt, Miles said. Own what you buried. You think they'll let me? Preston asked, voice low. They're circling already. Then let them, Miles said. Let them circle. Let them whisper. But when the lights flicker next time, ask yourself, was it me? Or the design I left behind to catch the moment you looked away? Preston closed his eyes. The cold bit deeper now, but he didn't. Did you know this would happen? No, Miles said. I knew it could. There's a difference. What triggered it wasn't my doing. It was yours. The system didn't betray you. It just remembered what you forgot. What did I forget? Preston whispered. Miles paused, then answered with a sentence that landed like a hammer wrapped in cloth. That silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it means observation. Preston stayed on the call long after Miles had hung up. Not because he expected more, but because his ears weren't ready for the silence that came next. The kind that doesn't echo. The kind that watches. They gathered in room 7C, not because it was the most secure, but because it was the most ordinary. No projector, no polycom, just chairs, a table, and the weight of what they had all chosen to ignore for far too long. Marla, Clara, Jeremy, 2 legal counsels and Preston, each one holding a copy of the same internal memo. System self-acknowledgement flag, Echo Set 19. Immutable confirmation. No one knew what immutable confirmation even meant, not officially, but the subtext was clear. The system had validated its own logic, and had reviewed the flags, authenticated the sandbox triggers, and logged its own escalation protocols as intact. In essence, the machine had agreed with itself. Miles hadn't pressed a button, no whistle was blown, yet every action taken since the first ghost deletion had echoed upward, as if the architecture itself had started whispering, I remember. Jeremy was the first to speak, voice thin but trying for strength. We can't operate like this. Every action feels observed. Every query reroutes to redundant logs. It's like the system's breathing. Clara looked up from her notes, calm. Not breathing. Responding. You're interacting with design integrity, not surveillance. Same thing, Jeremy muttered. Not when the system's asking you to notice yourself, she replied. Marla cleared her throat. We're not here to fight the infrastructure. We're here to decide if we keep pretending we own something we no longer understand, or if we admit what this really is. A coup, Jeremy said, by a man we thought was gone. Preston didn't look at him, didn't correct him, because even he no longer believed that. Miles didn't program this to fight us, he said finally. He built it to outlast us, and it has. No one spoke. The silence was precise. Clara reached into her folder and slid a paper across to Marla. This is the clause no one saw coming, the post-sex integrity clause, buried in IF-17. It doesn't trigger if Miles logs in. It triggers if we lie to the system. Jeremy frowned. Lie how? By violating the logic paths it was told to protect, like masking payments, or rerouting oversight, or issuing deletion requests on flagged content without secondary review. She looked around the room. It doesn't care about guilt. It cares about deviation. Preston leaned forward, elbows on the table. So we can't shut it off. You could try, Clara said, but it's woven in too deep. You'd unravel half the company's operational spine trying to excise it, and even if you did, you'd still have to answer for why. Jeremy exhaled, loud. So what's left? We just accept it? Let the damn thing babysit us forever? Marla's voice was quieter. Or learn from it. Let it speak. Let it recalibrate how we see what we built. Preston stood, walked to the far window, stared at his own reflection, layered over the city skyline. For months, he'd believed Miles was the threat, that the problem was a person. But what stared back at him now was something far worse. A system that remembered everything, including their forgetting. Behind him, Clara added one last note. Miles never asked to return. The system never punished. It only responded when we tried to bury what wasn't meant to be hidden. Preston closed his eyes. Not in defeat, but in recognition. Not of Miles, but of a truth deeper than any protocol. They had looked into the system, expecting silence, and found a mirror instead. And for the first time in years, Preston finally asked himself the one question that mattered. What kind of company do we become if we let the mirror stay? Legacy isn't measured by who applauds when you leave. It's measured by what still stands when your name no longer echoes through the hallway. Miles didn't fight to return. He didn't need to. Because somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the budget cuts and polished lies, he had already written his presence into the bones of the place. Not through ego, through intention. They thought erasing a name from payroll meant erasing a mind. But architecture doesn't forget its builder, especially when that builder designed it to prioritize truth over authority. That's the difference between power and principle. One controls for now, the other lasts beyond you. Preston and his team didn't fall into a trap. They tripped over their own reflection. The system didn't retaliate. It remembered. It spoke when lies grew louder than leadership. It whispered only when necessary. And it mirrored exactly what it saw. Not sabotage, but decay. Not defiance, but denial. What haunts people like Preston isn't the exposure, it's realizing that someone they discarded with a quiet click still had the foresight to build something honest enough to hold up a mirror years later. And the worst part? That mirror didn't judge. It simply asked, is this still the place you once believed in? That's the kind of revenge Miles left behind. Not viral, not loud, just unshakable. The kind that doesn't slam doors but leaves them open long enough for the truth to walk back in. So, if you're building anything, systems, teams, legacies, build them so well they don't need you to defend them. Build them to resist not failure, but forgetfulness. Because one day, someone will try to delete your name, and if you did it right, the silence you leave behind won't collapse. It will clarify. It will carry your weight without asking permission. It will speak softly, but be heard completely. Make sure what you leave behind knows exactly who it belongs to.